August 16th, 1944, near Argentan, France. The thunder of artillery had finally quieted, replaced by the metallic groan of tank treads and the constant rattle of engines. The fields were scorched, the hedgerows torn apart, and a line of dust stretched to the horizon. In the distance, General George S. Patton stood by his command jeep, a cigar clamped between his teeth, staring eastward through his binoculars. His Third Army had broken free of Normandy's chokehold, and now they were unstoppable, or so it seemed. Behind him, the tanks sat idle, engines rumbling but going nowhere. Crews lounged beside their steel beasts, staring at empty jerry cans. Trucks meant to deliver fuel were scattered miles back, bogged down on cratered roads or jammed at bridges destroyed by retreating Germans. Patton as spearhead, his armored divisions that had sliced through Brittany and turned toward the Seine were dead in the water. He spat into the dirt and growled to his staff officer, "My men can fight, my tanks can move, but damn it, they can't do both without gas." It wasn't a figure of speech. The Third Army, the most aggressive striking force on the continent, was running on fumes. What had begun as a lightning advance now threatened to collapse under the weight of its own success. Every mile forward stretched the fragile American supply line thinner and thinner, until it snapped. To the west, the ports of Cherbourg and St. Lo were still a logistical nightmare. Wrecked docks, destroyed cranes, and narrow roads choked with mud and traffic. Supplies had to be offloaded onto landing craft, ferried to beaches, and driven inland over makeshift roads. It was an absurd way to support an army of 500,000 men. Yet that was the reality of war in Europe in the late summer of 1944. The Allies had planned for a slow grind across France, careful, measured, methodical. But Patton didn't fight like that. He moved like lightning. His tanks, armored columns, and infantry surged forward faster than anyone anticipated, outrunning their maps, their communications, and most critically, their supplies. And so, for all the talk of American industrial might, the Third Army's lifeblood, fuel, ammunition, food, was trapped behind clogged routes and bureaucratic chaos. Truck convoys waited for hours just to move a few miles. Mechanics scavenged for spare tires, drivers slept on their steering wheels, and logistics officers worked by lantern light, sketching routes that changed daily. Patton's operations officer, Colonel Charles Codman, looked over the fuel reports and grimaced. "At this rate," he muttered, "we'll have tanks with empty guns and trucks without fuel." Patton didn't blink. "Then we'll build our own damn lifeline," he said. What came next would become one of the greatest logistical operations in military history, a feat of organization and endurance that no one outside the front lines believed possible. It would be called the Red Ball Express. The idea was simple, but its execution bordered on madness. The name came from American railroad slang. Red ball trains were high-priority express runs, signaled by a red disc to indicate urgency. Now that concept would be reborn on the roads of France. The U.S. Army would carve out a highway system across liberated territory dedicated exclusively to non-stop truck convoys supplying Patton's advance. Within days, engineers began painting red circles on road signs, marking routes from the beaches near Normandy all the way to Chartres and beyond. Only trucks with the Red Ball insignia could use those roads. Everyone else was forbidden. The rules were absolute. Trucks moved one way east with supplies, and another way west empty. No stops, no detours, no excuses. But while the generals drew lines on maps, the men who'd make it real were the truck drivers, thousands of them. Many were African-American soldiers from quartermaster truck companies, men who'd been assigned to labor and service units far from the front. Few of them had been trusted with combat duty. Now they were being handed the keys to the most vital artery of Patton's war machine. Private Harold Jackson, 21 years old from Alabama, climbed into the cab of his GMC-2 1.2-ton deuce-and-a-half truck. It was nicknamed the workhorse of the Army, a boxy, roaring monster that could haul nearly 3 tons of cargo across any terrain. The steering wheel shook like a jackhammer, and the cab smelled of fuel, sweat, and hot metal. Jackson adjusted his helmet, glanced at the convoy ahead stretching into the dusk, and muttered, "All right, baby, let's roll." The Red Ball Express officially roared to life on August 25, 1944, the same day Paris was liberated. But for these men, the glory of victory parades meant little. Their battlefield was the road, narrow, cratered, crawling with dust and danger. The convoys ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. If a truck broke down, it was pushed off the road. If a tire blew, you fixed it fast, or risked being left behind. By day, they dodged columns of infantry and refugees. By night, they drove blackout, headlights off, guided only by the red glow of taillights ahead. The Germans knew the lifeline existed. Luftwaffe planes prowled overhead, strafing the highways. Saboteurs hid mines beneath bridges. Drivers carried rifles beside them, ready to fight if they had to. Still, the trucks rolled. Hour after hour, day after day, from Normandy to Chartres, from Chartres to Verdun, from Verdun to Patton's front line. Each convoy carried food, ammunition, medical supplies, and, most importantly, gasoline. Millions of gallons of it, packed in 5-gallon jerry cans stacked to the roof. For every shell fired in Patton's guns, every mile a Sherman tank rolled forward, a truck driver somewhere had risked his life to get it there. By the end of August, more than 6,000 trucks were roaring across the Red Ball routes, manned by nearly 23,000 drivers. 75% of them were black. They drove for 16 hours a day, often sleeping under their vehicles before heading out again. Fuel dumps sprang up across the countryside, and maps filled with new depots marked P1, P2, and P3, Patton's lifeline designations. He knew every gallon mattered. His tanks advanced toward Germany, fueled by the sweat and courage of men whose names would never appear in the headlines. And while enemy generals mocked America's sprawling supply chain, they would soon learn that this circus of trucks could move faster and harder than any army in history. The Red Ball Express wasn't just keeping up. It was blitzing through Europe, just like the army it served. September 1944, northern France. The Red Ball Express was no longer just a supply route. It was a lifeline pulsing through the heart of Europe. Day and night, convoys thundered along the narrow country roads, engines roaring like an endless storm. Each column stretched for miles, hundreds of trucks snaking through ruined villages, past fields littered with burned-out German armor and abandoned helmets. Dust hung thick in the air, coating windshields and faces in a gray film that turned every soldier into a ghost behind the wheel. Private Harold Jackson's unit had been on the road for 36 hours straight. The sun had long since disappeared behind low clouds, and now the only light came from the faint red dots of the convoy's taillights ahead. He kept one hand on the steering wheel and the other on a canteen of cold coffee that had gone bitter hours ago. His co-driver, Private Lewis Carter, snored beside him, head tilted back, mouth open, oblivious to the bone-rattling ride. Jackson smirked. "You sleep now, brother. I'll keep us moving." The convoy's orders were clear: fuel and ammunition to the forward depots near Verdun. No delays, no detours. Each truck carried 2.5 tons of gasoline, enough to keep a battalion of Shermans rolling another few miles toward the German border. But between here and there lay hundreds of miles of treacherous, narrow, and often bombed-out roads. At a crossroads near Dreux, a military police jeep blocked the way, its headlamps dimmed and its driver waving them through. A small sign with a red circle and a white arrow pointed east. Red Ball Route. These MPs worked around the clock, directing traffic, keeping civilians off the road, and ensuring the convoys never stopped moving. Every delay, even a minute, could ripple down the line for miles. The drivers called it riding the pipeline. It was an unbroken chain of motion and danger, and everyone knew the rules. No stopping for anything. If a truck broke down, you pushed it off the road and kept going. If a tire blew, you changed it under fire. If the Germans attacked, you drove faster. And the Germans did attack. Luftwaffe fighters, desperate to cut off Patton's supply lines, strafed the roads at dawn and dusk. Jackson had seen it once already. 2 Messerschmitts screaming down low, their machine guns tearing through the column. Trucks exploded into flames, fuel drums erupting into geysers of fire. The survivors pulled their burning comrades from the wrecks, then climbed back into the cabs and kept driving. There was no turning back. Every man on the Red Ball knew that stopping could mean death, not just for themselves, but for the soldiers fighting at the front. If the trucks didn't get through, the tanks stopped, and the offensive stalled. They weren't just drivers. They were combat lifelines. By mid-September, the operation had grown into a full-scale miracle of movement. More than 12,000 tons of supplies were delivered every day. The convoys consumed 300,000 gallons of fuel daily just to keep moving. Mechanics worked non-stop to keep the trucks alive, patching tires with rubber scraps, scavenging engines from wrecks, even welding broken frames back together with field torches. Every vehicle that could roll was pressed into service. To keep the flow efficient, the Army set up a one-way loop, 2 parallel roads, one for eastbound loaded convoys, one for westbound empty trucks returning to the beaches. Signs painted with red balls marked every intersection. Drivers joked that if you followed the red ball long enough, you'd end up in Berlin. But humor was the only relief they had. The work was grueling. Many of the men were young, barely out of high school, and had never driven anything bigger than a pickup before the war. Now, they were steering 6-ton monsters through enemy territory on no sleep, often without proper food or rest. They wore out boots faster than they could be replaced. Their hands were blistered from gripping the wheel for hours on end. Corporal Joe Taylor from Chicago remembered one stretch near Reims where rain turned the road into a sea of mud. Trucks slid off the embankments, wheels spinning uselessly. He and his crew spent 12 hours knee-deep in muck, chaining trucks together to pull one another out. "We didn't stop till every last one was moving," he said later. "You didn't want to be the one holding up the line. You didn't want to be the reason Patton ran out of gas." The general himself understood that better than anyone. Patton often visited the supply routes personally, tearing down the roads in his Jeep, waving at the truckers. When one driver saluted him from the cab, Patton barked, "Keep your damn hands on the wheel, soldier." He knew their work was as critical as any tank battle. "My men can't shoot without ammo, can't eat without rations, and can't move without gasoline," he told his staff. "The Red Ball Express is my lifeline. God help anyone who breaks it." The convoys became a symbol of sheer endurance. Civilians along the route would stand by the roadside, waving as the trucks thundered past, sometimes offering bread or wine to the passing soldiers. The French called them les routiers américains, the American road warriors. For the drivers, those small gestures meant everything. By early October, the Red Ball Express had hauled more than 400,000 tons of supplies, enough to fuel the liberation of France and keep the Allied armies surging toward the German border. It was an achievement few thought possible. The Germans had laughed at the idea of maintaining such long supply lines across destroyed territory. But they weren't laughing anymore. Still, the road to victory came with a cost. Dozens of drivers were killed in accidents or ambushes. Hundreds more were injured, burned, or lost to exhaustion. Many of their names never made it into the newspapers. But for every man lost, another climbed behind the wheel and kept going, because that was the mission. Every night, when the engines finally cooled and the roads went dark, the only sound left was the ticking of cooling metal and the whispered prayer that tomorrow the trucks would still roll, because without them, the war would grind to a halt. And soon, as the front approached the borders of Germany, the demands would grow even greater. The Red Ball Express would be pushed to its absolute limit and beyond. October 1944, eastern France. The rain had returned, turning the dirt highways into rivers of mud. Convoys crawled forward, their engines whining under the weight of fuel drums and ammunition crates. Tires sank deep into ruts, spinning helplessly as drivers cursed, shoved, and pulled with chains. The trucks that once roared proudly down the Red Ball routes now groaned through terrain barely fit for tractors. It wasn't just hard, it was nearly impossible. Private Harold Jackson gripped his steering wheel tighter, his knuckles white under his gloves. He'd been on the same route for 12 days straight. Verdun to Nancy, back to Chartres, then out again. Each trip blurred into the next. His eyes burned from exhaustion. His back screamed with pain. The truck S-cab had become his entire world, a vibrating metal coffin filled with the constant roar of the engine, the stink of fuel, and the taste of dust. He wasn't alone. The Red Ball Express was wearing itself thin. The trucks were falling apart faster than they could be repaired. Engines overheated, transmissions failed, and axles cracked under the endless strain. Mechanics worked with whatever they could find: wire, scrap, or spare parts stripped from wrecked vehicles. Some trucks ran with mismatched tires or patched fuel tanks that leaked with every bump. And then, there was the weather. Fall in France meant endless rain, fog, and cold. Convoys ran through sheets of mud that swallowed jeeps whole. Drivers could barely see more than a few feet ahead. Some trucks skidded into ditches or collided in the dark, their loads spilling across the road. Others were ambushed by small pockets of German resistance, stragglers from shattered units who'd taken to the woods, waiting to strike. The army called them Werwolf, bands of saboteurs and fanatics who planted mines or sniped at convoys before vanishing back into the forest. The Red Ball drivers called them something simpler: the Shadows. They knew the sound of gunfire too well. A burst of automatic fire from the tree line, a shouted warning, and chaos erupted. On one October morning near Metz, Jackson's convoy came under attack. Bullets ripped through the trees, shattering the windshield of the lead truck. Jackson slammed on the brakes as the road ahead erupted in sparks and dust. Without hesitation, he jumped from the cab, grabbed his M1 carbine, and fired toward the muzzle flashes. Around him, other drivers did the same. Men who'd never been trained for combat, now fighting to protect the very supplies that kept the front alive. Within minutes, the ambush was over. The attackers melted away, leaving behind only the smell of gunpowder and burning fuel. Jackson climbed back into his cab, his hands trembling. He lit a cigarette with shaking fingers, exhaled hard, and muttered, "Ain't no rear in this war." Then he started the engine and rolled on. Every man who drove the Red Ball Express understood that reality. There was no safety zone. There was no back line. The moment they left the depots, they were in enemy territory, targets on wheels carrying the most precious resource of all: fuel. Each jerry can in their cargo bed meant another tank moving forward, another battle won. But the strain was taking its toll. The Third Army's hunger for fuel was insatiable, millions of gallons per week. Patton's forces were pushing toward the Moselle River, and every mile forward stretched the supply chain to breaking. The Red Ball route, nearly 400 miles long, could no longer keep up. General John C. H. Lee, commander of the communications zone, warned that the system was collapsing under its own weight. "We're burning gasoline faster than we can deliver it," he said grimly. "If we keep this up, we'll run dry." The British, slower and more methodical, had shifted to rail supply. But for Patton's Americans, speed was everything. Trucks were their arteries, and now those arteries were clogging fast. To make matters worse, trucks and drivers were being reassigned to other operations. New supply routes were opening to support Montgomery A.S. advance in the north and Bradley A.S. push toward Aachen. The Red Ball drivers, already stretched thin, had to cover more ground with fewer men. Accidents multiplied. Fatigue became deadly. Some drivers fell asleep at the wheel, their trucks drifting off the road or colliding in the dark. Still, the convoys rolled, because stopping wasn't an option. Every soldier at the front depended on them. In the freezing dawn hours, Jackson would sometimes look out across the hills and see the faint flashes of artillery in the distance. Patton S tanks firing, advancing, fighting. That was the reminder of why he drove. Every jerrycan he delivered might keep one of those tanks alive for another hour. Every trip might mean another push toward Germany's heart. By late October, the Red Ball Express had become a legend. Newspapers back home printed stories of the tireless truckers of France, men who conquered distance and danger to feed the Allied war machine. But the truth was grimmer than the headlines. The drivers were exhausted, their equipment failing, their nerves frayed. They joked, they sang, they prayed, but deep down, they all knew the end of the line was coming. On November 16, 1944, after 81 days of non-stop operation, the Red Ball Express officially shut down. The front had moved too far east, and railroads, finally repaired and secured, took over much of the load. For the first time in nearly 3 months, the roaring highways fell silent. When the last convoy rolled back toward the beaches, many of the drivers didn't cheer. They just sat quietly in their cabs, listening to the engines cool. They'd done the impossible. They'd turned chaos into order, dust into movement, and gasoline into victory. But they'd also paid the price in sweat, sleepless nights, and comrades lost on the road. General Patton would later say, "My men can fight like hell, but they can't fight without food and fuel." And that's what the Red Ball Express gave us. He knew that without those convoys, his tanks would have stopped cold in the fields of France. What began as a desperate improvisation had become a symbol of American ingenuity, speed, and determination. The Red Ball Express didn't just keep up with Patton's advance, it defined it. It proved that logistics, not just firepower, could win wars. And as winter fell over France, the battered roads lay quiet again, bearing the tire marks of thousands of trucks that had carved a path to victory. Winter, 1944. The roads that once roared with the thunder of engines now lay silent under a crust of frost. Abandoned fuel drums, tire tracks frozen in the mud, and twisted wrecks of trucks stood as ghosts of a race that had pushed men and machines beyond all reason. Yet the work of the Red Ball Express had not ended. It had evolved. The lessons learned from those 81 days of relentless motion would shape how the U.S. Army fought and supplied itself for the rest of the war. When railroads finally took over the bulk of supply transport, the drivers of the Red Ball Express were reassigned to new routes, some shorter, others even more dangerous. Patton's tanks were closing in on the German border, the Ardennes looming ahead. Winter had turned every mile into misery, and though the name Red Ball Express officially ended in November, its spirit lived on in dozens of follow-up operations. The White Ball, Green Diamond, and ABC Express routes, all modeled on that first audacious experiment in mobility. In depots across France, mechanics still wore their red ball patches with pride. The emblem, a red circle on white, had become a badge of honor. It meant you'd been part of something bigger than yourself. It meant you'd driven through hell and back to keep the front alive. It meant you'd been one of the few who truly understood what it meant to keep an army moving. General Eisenhower himself called the Red Ball Express a miracle of supply. Without it, he admitted, the Allied advance after Normandy might have ground to a halt. The Germans had believed the Allies could never sustain their momentum once they broke out of the beaches. They were wrong. American logistics, those endless convoys of trucks, manned mostly by young, exhausted drivers, had done what no one thought possible. They had outrun the enemy, outrun the terrain, and even outrun their own limits. But for many of the men who made it happen, recognition came slowly, if at all. Nearly 3/4 of Red Ball drivers were African-American soldiers, serving in segregated units. They were often denied basic comforts, housed in separate camps, and given the hardest, dirtiest work. Yet when history called, they delivered. They drove day and night, through enemy fire and exhaustion, without complaint. Their courage didn't just fuel tanks, it broke barriers. Private Harold Jackson was one of them. After the war, he returned home to Alabama, trading the roar of engines for the quiet hum of civilian life. He'd never forget those endless nights on the road, the blackouts, the ambushes, the laughter, the fear. Sometimes, when he heard the rumble of a passing truck, he'd feel it again. The vibration through the wheel, the smell of diesel, the ghostly glow of taillights stretching into the dark. "We didn't wear medals," he once said, "but every gallon we delivered was worth one." The Red Ball Express was more than a convoy. It was a symbol of how America fought its wars, with industry, innovation, and the willpower of ordinary men doing extraordinary things. Every bridge they crossed, Every mile of road they conquered was a victory of logistics over chaos. It proved that wars weren't won by firepower alone, but by the invisible hands that kept the guns loaded, the bellies full, and the engines running. By the end of the war, the U.S. Army had delivered more than 400,000 tons of supplies through the Red Ball route. That staggering figure would become the foundation of modern military logistics. Future operations, from Korea to Vietnam, from Iraq to Afghanistan, would all echo its lessons: mobility, speed, discipline, and the unwavering resolve of the supply corps. In post-war Europe, French villagers would still talk about the endless stream of trucks that thundered through their towns, the drivers waving, sometimes tossing candy or rations to children as they passed. To them, the Red Ball Express wasn't just a convoy, it was liberation in motion. It was the sight and sound of America's promise rumbling eastward toward victory. Decades later, historians would look back and call it one of the most important but least recognized operations of the war. Hollywood would dramatize it, documentaries would praise it, and military academies would study it. But for the men who lived it, the memory was simpler. It was about the road, the miles of dust and danger, the engines that never stopped, the comrades who didn't make it home. The Red Ball Express proved that logistics could be as heroic as combat. When others saw only chaos, these men built a system that turned raw power into unstoppable motion. They showed that even in the most brutal of wars, victory often rides not on tanks or guns, but on the wheels of those who keep them moving. As snow began to fall over the empty French highways, the echoes of the convoys faded into history. But somewhere, deep in the rumble of every truck engine that followed, there was still the faint heartbeat of the Red Ball Express, the sound of courage on the road to victory.